Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us this morning. Um, we have about 40 people registered for the event, so I'm going to give everyone a couple of more minutes to join. While we wait, I recommend you check that your microphone is off. And in general, if you keep your video off, it also helps sometimes with the quality of like the images and video that you're going to be receiving. We're gonna have time for Q&A at the end. I'm assuming Brian will have like enough time.
Sure. Yeah.
But
I'll
if
do
you have
myself to pace myself well.
if you have questions, I encourage you to put them into the chat box so that we can make sure you don't forget them and we address them at the end. I'm recording the session and I'll share the recording with everyone who registered. So there's that, so you can go back and take a look at it. So it's 11:03, so why don't we get started? I want to thank our colleagues at the Conafay Group for helping us put together this event and others that we've had over the last year, introducing our campus to our different sponsors. Some of them we might not be so familiar with, so these sessions really allow us to just get kind of like a 101 orientation, I like to call it. If you're not familiar with the Conafay Group, we've been working with them for the past about year and a half, and they've been helping a lot of our faculty align their research with Department of Defense funding opportunities, particularly in the life sciences, medical sciences, biological sciences. And maybe Brian will talk a little bit about that. And so that's a service that the Office of Research covers and is available free of charge to everyone on campus. So if after this session you want to explore having a consultation or learning more about how you can use their services, please send me an email and I'll be happy to help you with that. So with that, I'm very happy to introduce Brian Tse to the meeting today. Brian is a uh, senior vice president at the Conafay Group, and he worked at BARDA for more than 10 years. So he is going to be speaking from experience here. And so I'm not going to provide a lengthy introduction. I'm going to just let Brian take it on from here.
Got it. Good afternoon, everyone, or I guess morning for you guys. Thanks for making the time. Just gonna pull up my slides real fast. Give them a moment. Let me know when you guys can see that. I'll shut my camera off as well just to preserve bandwidth.
Looks great.
All right, perfect. Just a real quick outline. Just giving a brief introduction to myself as well as the other members of the Conafay Group. From there, I can give you just a quick overview of the agency that is BARDA, just so you have an understanding of why the agency was set up, how it's structured, what its primary interests and mission space is. From there, we can transition to a discussion about its primary funding opportunities, that is, those that I think would be of greatest interest to academic performers and startups derived from your university. And then lastly, just want to share a couple of thoughts on how academics can work with BARDA. As you'll see, a lot of the bread and butter of what BARDA does is product development, working with pharmaceutical companies and biotech. But there are opportunities or ways that academic communities can work with BARDA as well. And I want to make sure you understand what those opportunities look like. And then as Anna had referenced before, we can do a little bit of Q&A at the end. So unless anyone has any initial questions or comments, we can just kind of dive right in. As Anna had mentioned, I spent 11 years in the Department of Health and Human Services at BARDA, overseeing a lot of our public-private partnerships with the pharmaceutical industry. My background is actually, though, in organic chemistry, so don't really have the clinical background going into this, though a lot of it I picked up, I'll say, through osmosis by virtue of leading a lot of these clinical development programs. In terms of what the Conafay Group does, we're rather a government relations firm focused on the life sciences that does a lot of work in terms of the policy side of the house. So we have individuals that used to work up on Capitol Hill that can guide clients in terms of advocacy, for example, greater appropriations for certain research programs, as well as individuals like myself and Eric, who used to work at the federal executive funding agencies and can guide clients in terms of the pursuit of non-dilutive funding. I know that is the primary interest for a lot of the work that we do with UC Davis. Pictured here are the four team members, Jessica, Eric, Evie, and Kristen, that I know do a lot of the forward-facing for our organization with UC Davis. But if I can become useful in terms of our engagement, I'm always happy to join a call and give a little bit of advice based on my perspectives of BARDA or other federal agencies where I have a little bit of useful experience. Okay. So just transitioning a little bit to BARDA, I think the easiest way to understand a federal agency is to understand the circumstances in which it was created and the problem that it was created to solve, right? Put another way, every superhero has an origin story, and seeing that origin story helps you understand why the agency is set up the way that it is. In terms of BARDA's origin, there are really two seminal events in the US government, in the US's history that led to its creation. The first, as you may guess, is September 11th. This is really kind of a watershed moment in the US's history where we are forced to recognize that there are individuals intent on using weapons of mass destruction against the United States. And then when we did see the anthrax attacks in the immediate aftermath of the initial terrorist attack, we had to recognize that those weapons of mass destruction extend beyond those of conventional warfare to things like chemical weapons, like sarin gas potentially, biological weapons like smallpox or anthrax, or even radiological or nuclear devices, like an improvised nuclear detonation device, right? So part of the question is, how do we better prepare for those kinds of emergencies, as well as those that could arise from naturally emerging threats, for example, H5N1 influenza pandemics, or like more recently we saw with the coronavirus for COVID-19. The second event that really led to BARDA's creation is actually the 2005 hurricane season, in which we saw the landing of Hurricane Katrina against the Gulf Coast, in particular New Orleans, in which case it made patently clear that the federal government needs to play a central role when it comes to emergency preparedness and response. And when we focus on national health security needs, that is no different. That there needs to be an agency that leads the preparedness and response component for national health security. So in 2006, Congress passed a law called the Pandemic All Hazards and Preparedness Act, or the PAPA for short, that led to the creation of a new entity within the Department of Health and Human Services called ASPR. Initially, it was called the Office of the Assistant Secretary for Preparedness and Response. Then in 2002 was elevated to its full operating division, the Administration for Strategic Preparedness and Response. It is essentially a peer organization of CDC, of NIH, of FDA, those organizations. And the essential mission of ASPR is to lead the nation in public health preparedness, response to, and recovery from disasters and public health emergencies, right? The central agency. Now, as I mentioned before, a key challenge here is the nature of the emergencies that they're preparing for. When it comes to national health security for things like bioterrorism, chemical or radiological nuclear weapons, or pandemics, part of our ability to respond to those crises and by extension to prepare for them is to have the right kind of medical products available to the public at that time. And realizing that is a very specialized skill set in terms of working with industry to develop those medical products, that is why they felt the need to create an agency called BARDA to help foster the development of those products. So just a real quick overview of the ASPR organizational chart. Wouldn't be a government talk without an org chart. You can see there are centers here that focus on preparedness infrastructure, like the Medical Reserve Corps, to supplement medical teams as needed for emergencies, running the Secretary's Operations Center. There's those that are focused more on the response element, like logistics, the National Disaster Medical System. But you can see BARDA here, focused specifically on the medical countermeasure component, as well as the Center for the Strategic National Stockpile, what we call SNS, which serves as a repository of critical essential medicines that are needed to respond to things like pandemics and other health crises. In terms of what BARDA does specifically, it is a government agency that supports the development and procurement of medical countermeasures. By that, I mean things like vaccines, drugs, therapeutics, devices, diagnostics, etc., for public health emergencies. But what makes BARDA a really interesting place is the type of public health emergencies that we focus on preparing for. That includes attacks from things of man-made weapons of mass destruction, what we call CBRN in the business. Again, chemical weapons, biological or radiological nuclear threats, pandemic influenza, and emerging infectious diseases. The essence of this is to say, hey, if we recognize we have a requirement for something like an anthrax vaccine or a therapeutic for being exposed to radiation, we can engage with agency and say, hey, if you have a technology that can address this, you can submit a proposal to us. And if we like it, we can fund it on the order of millions of dollars to try and get your product through FDA approval out into the market where it can serve as a life-saving intervention during one of these emergencies. That is the essence of what BARDA does. So a lot of the question when you want to partner with BARDA is, how can I help BARDA achieve its mission of developing those medical products, right? So true to its name, BARDA really does focus on what we call the advanced research and development space. So what I've shown here is the product development pipeline, all the way through from early discovery, all the way up through FDA approval. It turns out that in the earlier stages of development, discovery science, maybe preclinical, the pipelines actually have quite a good number of candidates in them. And a lot of that is because places like the NIH fund a lot of that work, right? $48 billion a year go to NIH, some of that going to biosecurity. But as you start to move forward into the clinical stages of development, where things get a little bit more expensive in terms of proceeding, right? Clinical studies, you enter what's called the valley of death, where products start to languish because there isn't as much of a commercial need for these kinds of medical products, right? Even though we can agree that you need something like an anthrax vaccine, since anthrax attacks don't happen regularly, thank God for that, the absence of that commercial market make it difficult for companies to get the resources they need to fund it. That's where places like BARDA will come in to provide the non-dilutive funding to pay for these clinical studies, as well as provide core services to support these companies. For example, the non-clinical studies network, where they have a network of pre-selected vendors that can conduct studies on behalf of companies, as well as industry veterans on staff who can serve as subject matter experts to advise the companies as well. Now, what's interesting is over the past couple of years, even though BARDA is fundamentally focused on advanced development, we're starting to see BARDA reach a little bit earlier in the development pipeline through its Division of Research, Innovation, and Ventures, or DRIVE division, or programs like the CARB-X Biopharmaceutical Accelerator for developing novel antibacterials, in order to create a more robust ecosystem for startups, and in doing so, a more robust early stage pipeline to feed into its advanced development pipeline. And just to emphasize this one point here, a key part of developing these products is to make sure that they are ready for the United States in the event of an emergency. So for certain products that address a specific recognized threat, that is, say, the government recognizes, say, anthrax as a material threat to national security, once those products get into the later stages of development, BARDA can award a contract to them through Project BioShield that will pay for the latter stages of clinical development and non-clinical development, all the way through FDA approval, and then do an initial procurement under that contract to have that product placed into the strategic national stockpile in strategic undisclosed locations around the country so it's ready to go on a moment's notice, theoretically 12 hours in the continental United States. And in this way, it works closely with the SNS to make sure we have the right product stockpiled for these bioterrorism events or pandemics as needed. So one thing I would just like to highlight is the level of funding that we have in play here. BARDA basically oversees the use of three separate appropriations. You can see here the funding levels that were provided in FY26. So for what I'll call the Weapons of Mass Destruction or Bioterrorism Division, the CBR division, the funding right now is just a little bit over $1 billion. For the Project BioShield program I mentioned, which transitions products into the stockpile, about $850 million. And then Pandemic Influenza Division gets around $300 million a year. You can see that there's broad bipartisan support. So even in cases where, such as this year, where the president is proposing significant budget cuts to the agencies, we're still seeing support from Congress, so they're actually proposing for next year modest increases to the budget, despite HHS on the whole being proposed to take about a 4% cut. Part of our thinking here is that biosecurity is something that is seen as having broad bipartisan support because it touches on both national security as well as innovative science. So now that we've kind of laid out the mission space of what BARDA is, I do want to spend a little bit of time talking about some of the key funding opportunities that are at BARDA. And here's a list of some of the core ones that I want you to be familiar with. The flagship funding opportunity is something called the Broad Agency Announcement, or the BAA. This is the solicitation that is open on a rolling basis pretty much year round with different areas of interest for the different BARDA programs, and I'll show you that in just a minute. It is the primary vehicle by which research and development partnerships are awarded by BARDA to take products usually through the clinical stages of development and through FDA approval. However, based on the lessons learned from COVID-19, the government realizes that it needs a more nimble, faster moving research and development ecosystem. And in that, it's starting to use what's called the consortium model, which I'll outline a little bit more in a minute. It currently has two consortiums, one called the Rapid Response Partnership Vehicle, or RRPV for short. This is the one that's dedicated on the rapid development of medical products, mostly vaccines, therapeutics, and medical technologies for companies that are within this consortium. And then in parallel, it also has a consortium called the Biopharmaceutical Manufacturing Preparedness Consortium, or BioMAP, whose primary mission is to ensure that the United States has the manufacturing infrastructure it needs to quickly make medical products that we need scaled up, right? So for example, the ability to manufacture certain vaccines or biotherapeutics so that we don't have supply chain shortages as we started to see during COVID-19 as well. You may be familiar with some of the consortiums in the Department of War as well. These are very similar in structure to those, such as the Medical CBRN Defense Consortium, or MCDC, or MTech, which is the Medical Technologies Enterprise Consortium. It is those consortiums from the Department of War that BARDA learned the value of having this infrastructure established. Now, one of the things I discussed in one of the prior slides is that BARDA has an innovation division called DRIVE, Division of Research, Innovation, and Ventures, that is trying to better support innovative startups and better support an ecosystem. They have a couple of ways in which they do that. One of the things they used to have really was called the Easy BAA, a more streamlined, supposedly faster way of awarding smaller research and development partnerships to companies, usually under $750,000. That's currently closed right now. I won't be discussing that today, but it may come back at a later date. But I think a lot of the exciting opportunities are coming through their accelerator network, where they've established 5 specific accelerator hubs, each with their own specialty. I'll talk about that in just a minute, who have the ability to release new funding opportunities to the startup ecosystem as needed. And then somewhat uniquely, BARDA also has a program called BARDA Ventures, where they're partnering with an investment corporation to be able to make dilutive investments in early stage companies, which is to say, take an ownership stake with them, help them grow as a company. And then once that company gets acquired by a larger entity, often the off-ramp for a startup company, they can take the proceeds from that, put it back into the fund, and continue investing in other early stage companies. I'll talk about that in a little bit in a minute. And then BARDA also funds specifically for the antibacterials community, the Combating Antibiotic Resistant Bacterial Biopharmaceutical Accelerator, or CARB-X, run out of Boston University. I won't address that at length today, but just be aware that it is BARDA funded, as well as has funding from things like the UK government, the government of Germany, as well as the Wellcome Trust as well. So it's not only run by BARDA. Before we dive into the specific funding opportunities, I think it's worth spending a little bit of time talking about some of the new hot topics that we're seeing in BARDA funding. You will see these topics also be high priorities for places like NIH, as well as the Department of War, because they are basically priorities of the administration for biomedical purposes. One of the things we're really thinking about is what I'll call threat agnostic approaches, which is to say there's such a wide variety of potential threat agents or emerging infectious diseases. It becomes unsustainable to try and develop drugs or vaccines for each one of those potential threats. Therefore, the best preparedness solution is to develop medical products, medical countermeasures that can be used regardless of what kind of threat it is, or at least broad spectrum in nature. So one of the things that they're looking at are host-directed therapeutics. These are interventions that modulate the host response rather than targeting the pathogen specific to enhance the body's ability to withstand, mitigate, or recover from the impacts of that exposure, right? For example, If we know that a lot of threat agents induce a massive inflammatory response in your body, like a cytokine storm, if there are therapeutics that can target things in your body to reduce that inflammation, reduce the damage resulting from that exposure, that is a drug that can be used for a wide variety of different threat agents from a protection standpoint. So right now at BARDA, there's a lot of interest in these host-directed therapeutics for, in particular, the treatments of sepsis and acute respiratory distress syndrome. One of the other bigger concerns we're seeing in the government right now is the sustainability of a lot of the drugs in the marketplace. That is to say, if I were to develop a drug that only works for a biothreat agent, because there is no commercial market, it tends not to stick around on the market because there's no return on investment for it. So there's a lot of interest in what we call repurposing, where you take a commercial drug that is already FDA approved or at least in clinical development for it, and we try and use that drug and develop it for an indication that is relevant to national security, in addition to the commercially relevant indication. And part of the reason why this is also good is that that asset is significantly de-risked. It already has a clinical safety profile. You've already done a lot of the manufacturing development. You already have some preclinical understanding of mechanism of action. That tends to make that project seen as lower risk for the government as well. So if you can find a commercial drug that can be used for a national security interest, BARDA would potentially be interested in funding the development program to support that new indication. You may have heard the administration discuss wanting to move away from animal models for a variety of reasons, both ethical and the rising awareness of the fact that data from animals does not always translate well to humans. So there's a lot of interest in new approach methodologies, which is really alternatives to animal models, things like organ on a chip and other in vitro human-based systems, organoids, or in silico modeling, especially with things like artificial intelligence. So there's a lot of interest in projects that will take advantage of these methodologies to try and get through the regulatory approval pathway. AI, again, of course, is a big topic. A lot of the discussion of that is surrounding things like drug design. BARDA just released, for example, a request for information asking about technologies that could use AI to help them design new broad spectrum therapeutics for Ebola and other filoviruses. And then lastly, platform technologies continue to be of interest for BARDA and other entities where you have a well-understood platform technology that can generate new medical products that share key underlying features. An example that was used, of course, during COVID-19 is mRNA vaccines, where the mRNA injected into the body can be adapted specific to the pathogen. The ability to invest in these kind of technologies also give flexibility to the United States from pandemic response as well. So again, just focusing on that flagship solicitation, the broad agency announcement. For clarity, this is the partnership model that typically results from this are cost reimbursable contracts, or they use a new flexible partnership called Other Transaction Authority, or OTAs for short. Think of these as contracts with the government where you aren't required to have all of the typical clauses of the federal acquisitions regulations. And that gives the government a little bit more flexibility and makes the partnership a little bit more attractive for a lot of industry members that otherwise would be reluctant to partner with the government because of the burden of traditional contracts. The structure for these kinds of awards are usually a base period plus options that later on they get triggered based on certain milestones that are achieved. The dollar value of those base awards is a pretty wide range, can be anywhere from, say, roughly $5 to $50 million, depending on what is being funded in that base period. For example, on the less expensive end, proof of concept animal efficacy studies. On the more expensive end, if you're funding something like a phase 3 clinical trial. Like I mentioned, BARDA is really focused on advanced development. So most of the areas of interest here rely on products to be in the clinical stage of development, though some can lean a little bit further back. For example, the chemical or radiological nuclear programs, except programs that have in vivo proof of concept efficacy, plus a pre-IND meeting with FDA towards guiding what the regulatory pathway will look like. There are some exceptions to this, particularly those around platform technologies, where they can accept technologies that are earlier in technology maturity. From a submission standpoint, something that they very strongly encourage is before you submit any proposals to the BAA, that you engage with BARDA, either through their Tech Watch program, which is kind of a way of presenting your technology in general to BARDA and other funding agencies. I'll talk about that a little bit more. or with a more targeted pre-submission call with the program directors and staff of the specific program you have in mind. For example, if you want to have an antibiotic that you want to see developed, you can bring that to the antimicrobials team and get more specific feedback based on what they like, what they don't like, and what they might want to see in a proposal moving forward. From there, it becomes a two-stage submission process. The first is a submission of a quad chart and what they call a market research abstract. It's about 15 pages in total, not too bad of a lift. If they review that and give you some favorable feedback, you are then invited to submit what we often call a full proposal, which is about 50 pages of a technical proposal plus about 70 pages worth of appendices and a full cost proposal to boot. So a substantial lift from there. Their target is usually a contract award within 8 months of your market research abstract submission, though depending on the landscape, for example, right now, it takes a little bit longer to get release of the funding and approval from leadership, so those timelines can be extended a bit. Okay. And I can share the slide deck in the aftermath. There's a link here right to that broad agency announcement, or at least the latest iteration of it, if you do want to take a look. Here are the different areas of interest, primarily broken down by the divisions. So for the division of CBR and countermeasures, we have different program directors leading programs for CBR and vaccines, like anthrax and filoviruses, antivirals and antitoxins, focusing on things like, again, filoviruses, also smallpox, antimicrobials for bacterial biothreat agents like anthrax, plague, tularemia, also multi-drug resistant bacterial infections, as you might get while in a hospital, what we call secondary infections. Those are also of concern. The radiological nuclear threats program, as well as the chemical medical countermeasures program for things like radiation exposure or chemical weapon exposure, respectively. And then the burn and blast program, which thinks about mass casualty events involving many burn patients or many traumatic injury events resulting from things like explosive devices or, heaven forbid, nuclear detonations. There's a specific diagnostics, detection, and devices infrastructure division in BARDA as well that provides diagnostics funding that are matrixed across these. For example, biodosimetry for radiation exposure, diagnostics that can determine resistance profiles in bacterial infections, or even things like distinguishing between different viral strains for influenza. And then the influenza and emerging infections divisions, they are investing in novel vaccines for seasonal and pandemic influenza, as well as novel influenza therapeutics as well. A couple of cross-division areas of interest: immuneship, that's one of the new approach methodology funding opportunities led by the Drive division, as well as flexible and strategic therapeutics called FASTEX. This is a program where they invest in therapeutic platform programs, for example, next generation antibody-based approaches or nucleic acid approaches that can rapidly develop a novel therapeutic for an emerging pathogen. So now having discussed the broad agency announcement, I think we can transition a little bit to discussing what the consortium model is and BARDA's two consortiums. The easiest way to think about a consortium is it's a standing network of potential performers, think companies, academic institutions, research organizations that are managed by a consortium firm on behalf of a funding agency. And the big picture of this is the government realizes it takes a long time to award a new contract to a company to do research and development, right? I mentioned before, BARDA tries to do an award within 8 months of first submission to the broad agency announcement. But if we're trying to have a network that can be useful during a pandemic response, that's too long. So the fastest way to get around that is to form an existing partnership with many companies at once. And then when you need to award research and development funding to it, all you're doing is modifying your existing partnership, and that is a much faster route. So the essential idea here is BARDA picks a consortium management firm, what we call a CMF. They can send the funding and the R&D needs to that consortium management firm. And the consortium management firm retains partnerships with all of the member companies of that consortium, say different pharmaceutical companies, biotech, academic institutions. Whenever the funding and funding opportunity are given to them by BARDA, they do the source selection on behalf of the funding agency, in consult with the funding agency, I should say. They choose the winners of it and are able to give the research and development funding to the member companies that won. And because all of this is happening based on an existing partnership vehicle, they're able to award funding on a much faster basis. In response times, they say they may need to be able to award funding in as fast as 5 days. And I saw these things move that quickly during COVID-19. Right. All of this is based on that other transaction authority flexible partnership model that I mentioned before. Part of the challenge here for companies that want to work here is that they must apply to join and go through the lift of signing that partnership agreement initially before any funding opportunity can really be applied to. So again, the two funding consortiums are the Rapid Response Partnership Vehicle. Uh, this is the first one that is really focused on the rapid development of medical countermeasures, primarily vaccines, therapeutics, and med tech. Unlike the broad agency announcement, which is open year-round, they tend to release funding opportunities as a one-off opportunity. I'll show you what some of those look like in a minute. Again, you must be a member to apply to any one of these funding opportunities. And then the second one is the Biopharmaceutical Manufacturing Preparedness Consortium. Again, their focus is building infrastructure to support the rapid manufacture of medical countermeasures here in the US. A lot of their one-off funding opportunities are focused around developing advanced manufacturing approaches and potentially helping companies build out infrastructure to be able to produce things faster as well here in the US. So just to give you a little bit of flavor of what some of these funding opportunities look like, for the Rapid Response Partnership Vehicle, BARDA just released a funding opportunity for Bunabuyo virus outbreak response vaccines, or BundVX. This one seeks to repurpose an existing VSV vaccine platform, which was previously used for FDA licensed vaccines for Ebola, for this new Ebola virus strain, as well as to be able to produce up to 100,000 doses and options as needed to help support the emergency response in Africa right now. That funding opportunity recently for rapid antibody production for immunoassay diagnostics called RAPID. As referenced before, they also had a funding opportunity for host-directed therapeutics for the prevention of progression of ARDS, as well as a funding opportunity to develop assays to better understand potential efficacy for things like monoclonal antibody therapies or vaccines. For Biomap, we see funding opportunities like manufacturing optimization of filovirus monoclonal antibodies, increasing sterilization capacity here in the United States, and being able to do domestic capability build out for viral hemorrhagic fever vaccine candidates as well. They often partner with other entities in ASPR as well, in this case, wanting to build out infrastructure for manufacturing things like antimicrobials or large volume parenterals like IV bags. So you do see some funding opportunities purely for manufacturing of essential medicines as well. Okay. Now I know I'm covering a lot of ground here. Did we just want to do the Q&A at the end? Just want to confirm that.
Yes, I think I haven't seen any questions
Okay,
yet.
great. If you do have questions, I'm happy to answer them as we go. So feel free to speak up if you'd rather do it that way too. Okay, focusing a little bit more on early stage opportunities for academic centers or maybe startups that have recently spun out. BARDA recognizes the need to make investments in these communities. They wanted to really support an early stage R&D ecosystem for medical countermeasures. So they recently launched a network of specialized accelerator hubs, of which there are 5. One of them focused on diagnostics and medical devices called iCreate. This was originally set up by University Lab Partners, but I think is going to be relaunched soon with another provider for this. There's one called the Preparedness Digital Health Hub, focused on digital health technologies. One called the Vanguard Hub, supporting enabling technologies for things like expediting drug development itself or new approaches to biomanufacturing. There's one focused on special populations called Spark, run by Children's National Hospital here in DC. And then also a therapeutics and vaccine hub called Vital, led by the STAR2 group in Boston. So each of these kind of works almost like a consortium, except it doesn't have a standing network of members, but does have an OTA partnership with BARDA, where it can receive funding from BARDA and provide funding opportunities. And let me talk about that a little bit. Here are the typical programs run by each of the accelerator hubs. The first is what they call their accelerator programs, which is a competition that happens on an annual basis. This is really targeted at startup companies or university-based projects that are looking for a more translational home, where if you apply to the program and get admitted to it, you are basically admitted to get resources to help you build out your startup company or your university-based project, right? It's cost-free, equity-free, so non-dilutive. It gives you access potentially to early stage capital through the network that they have. It gives you access to mentors who have gone down the road before of standing up a startup company, right? And also gives you some collaborative lab space as well, in case you need that lab space to do some of your early proof of concept studies, as well as opportunities to network with individuals in the startup community as well. For those that are seeking non-dilutive funding, when we say non-dilutive, we mean in the sense of you receive the funding without having to give up any ownership stake of your startup company. They do have annual competitions as well for awards anywhere between 50 and 200,000 to do some of the early proof of concept studies, really targeting early stage biotech companies and academic institutions as well. These are relatively short-term contracts, about 6 months in duration, and are milestone driven, and are really designed to support the development, evaluation, and validation studies for early proof of concept. For example, taking an existing technology and using it in a BARDA relevant use case. For example, something that would be more relevant to national health security based on the existing platform. Maybe proof of concept work for something that is seen as a little bit higher risk and maybe something that wouldn't ordinarily be funded at a more traditional place like the NIH, or to really advance technologies in development that could eventually be fleshed out for something like a medical technology for greater use in national security space as well. That being said, I think the thing that tends to get the most interest from these accelerator network hubs is the unique funding opportunities that BARDA approaches them for to be able to work with early stage companies on newer technologies. And I'll show you what some of these look like. Perhaps the one that has gotten the greatest amount of attention is the one that's run through Vital, the Vaccines and Therapeutics Hub, called the Smart Antivirals Prize Competition. This one is where the Department of Health and Human Services, BARDA, really devoted $100 million to a multi-stage competition to find better ways and do demonstrations of developing broad-spectrum antivirals against two viral families. One of them is flaviviridae, the other togaviridae, based on the need to develop early-stage candidates for these viral families, as well as outline how fast can we move if we start to use technologies like in silico modeling or new approach methodologies to try and accelerate the development of these broad-spectrum antivirals as well. This one's particularly interesting because BARDA traditionally has not done a lot in the emerging infectious diseases space. Again, its funding has mostly been focused on, say, bioterrorism agents and pandemic influenza. So it's really encouraging to see BARDA get buy-in from senior leadership to invest in developing antivirals for these emerging infectious disease families, right? Other prize competitions that have been released, one through the iCreate, which is the Diagnostics and Devices Hub, to try and generate high performance testing and low cost diagnostics to be used in the home or in the field with a focus on high priority threats. A lot of interest right now in things like at home test to treat, right? And then the Vanguard just released one a few days ago. Again, they're the Enabling Technologies Hub for blood sampling competition. That is to say, are there ways we can do blood collection and processing in a distributed fashion, for example, at home, where then you can then use the sample that you collected, say a blood sample that has been converted to plasma, for that next generation diagnostic. You can also see more traditional non-funding opportunities. One of the first ones that Vital came out with was innovations in pre-exposure prophylaxis for respiratory viruses, where they invested in protein or peptide-based therapeutic platforms that could then be repurposed to be used in a prophylaxis methodology, that is to prevent the onset of infection rapidly. And also with a lot of interest in things like doing longer duration half-lives, so that maybe a single dose could be used once a month as an alternative to vaccines. So again, just some of the interesting new funding opportunities coming out through the Accelerator Network. I expect that we'll see more opportunities of these types in the near-term future. And then just real quickly wanted to touch upon BARDA Ventures. This is the dilutive investment form where BARDA can work with an entity called the Global Health Investment Corporation, which receives capital from BARDA. I believe BARDA has given them about $175 million to date, and then piggyback that funding with additional funding from the private sector. Places like CEPI, which is a European entity. I know FluLab, for example, which is a Google billionaire funded research and development entity for flu, have also piggybacked funding on this. They take that funding pot and make early stage investments, usually around Series A, into companies that they think have very promising technologies in the national health security space. Because of that, they can then have their industry veterans working at GHIC work with those companies to help them grow out their technology, find potential buyers, large pharma companies that may want to purchase this technology or at least license it. And then the proceeds from that spin out are then put back into the fund for continued investment, what we often call an evergreen investment fund, right? So to date, GHIC has made 32 investments and actually just had one of their companies acquired by Eli Lilly. It was a vaccines company, on the basis that Eli Lilly has decided to make a return into the infectious disease space and thought this technology to be very promising for both commercial and national health security purposes. So one of the things you can do is when engaging with BARDA is have a discussion about engaging with Global Health Investment Corporation if you're around the Series A fundraising to see if you'd be a good fit and if they'd be interested in making that kind of a dilutive investment as well. So one of the key questions here, of course, is how to better engage with BARDA. That is, how do you build awareness with BARDA about your technology? How do you provide a pitch to them based on the research interests and gauge their level of interest? Get an understanding of how they view your technology. There are two real good ways to do this. The first one is a program called TechWatch. It's about an hour-long presentation where you're given the opportunity to come into BARDA, usually virtually these days, give a presentation on your technology, your R&D portfolio, as well as pitch how you envision you could work with BARDA and what kind of funding that would require. It's a great opportunity to make them aware of your technology, secure feedback from them in terms of whatever the concerns they may have about your program, as well as get it in front of some of the other agency participants that often come to these meetings, including individuals from the Department of War, NIH, CDC, and even the FDA. A really great place to get an understanding of where you may be aligned to them, where there's a lot of interest in your technology, supporting downstream discussions, right? From there, you can also do what's called a pre-submission call with a specific team at BARDA. Let's say you went through a tech watch with a broad spectrum therapeutic approach. The influenza therapeutics team expressed a lot of interest and enthusiasm during the tech watch call. You are now starting to think about what kind of proposal you could put in front of BARDA through the broad agency announcement. You could reach out to the program director for influenza therapeutics, have a shorter call with them that's a little bit more focused on their specific interests, gauge their level of enthusiasm for your more detailed concept, get some feedback from them, so that when you do decide to submit a market research abstract, you have a better understanding of what it is they're looking for and a much higher probability of success. The way that you get one of these pre-submission calls is they have inboxes listed in the broad agency announcement. You can reach out to them directly by email. I forgot to say for requesting a Tech Watch call, BARDA has a BARDA Digital Resources portal. You can click on that link there, create an account, and then submit a Tech Watch meeting request where you have to answer a couple of questions and then submit a preliminary slide deck so they know who to invite to that meeting, both at BARDA and through other agencies. And this is just a quick picture of the official guidance that BARDA gives you in terms of preparing for it. Uh, um, the different things that BARDA will want to see in the presentation. Remember, they're advanced developers, so their expectations of things like what is your target product profile, which is to say, what is your vision for the product if you were to succeed through FDA approval? How is it differentiated from other products already in the market? What feedback have you already received from the agency? What does your development program, including clinical development, look like? What's your status of your manufacturing and intellectual property as well? I generally advise companies to try and keep things around 25 slides at most, and to prepare for a presentation that lasts maybe 25 to 30 minutes, give plenty of time for Q&A and discussions on the back end of it. This is something that is the bread and butter of our work here at the Conafay Group. If you want help preparing for a Tech Watch meeting, I'm happy to have a discussion with you. Does anyone have any questions before we keep going? I know I've been doing a lot of talking. Just want to make sure there aren't any glaring questions that would be really helpful for me to answer right now.
Hi, Brian. This is Asma. A wonderful talk so far. I wanted to know more about the Tech Watch. Though the slide you just presented is very useful, but are there any tricks for the Tech Watch engagement for the early career researchers at the
Yeah,
start?
um, this is where the discussions with individuals like us is often helpful because part of that depends on what your technology is and who you want to pitch to, I
Sure.
think really a good idea is to take a close look at the broad agency announcement about what specific threats they're most interested in, and
Okay.
then get an understanding of what the expectations are for entry into the portfolio. Is it expecting to see proof of concept data that compares yours against some certain standard of care, something of that nature? I think that's
Okay.
particularly helpful. I think
Sounds
something I really like to stress to entities going into TechWatch is this is very different from an investor briefing where there's a lot of focus on market size, return on investment, very high level in the science.
yeah.
The individuals that are coming to this call, they bring a lot along their subject matter experts. So these are individuals formerly of industry that have expertise in things like non-clinical toxicology, toxicology, regulatory affairs, clinical operations, pharmacovigilance, manufacturing. They will interrupt you in the middle of your question and ask very detailed technical questions. So you should
Okay.
make sure to bring members of your team that are in a position to answer those kinds of questions as well. So I think oftentimes companies that are expecting it to be more high level can be a little bit surprised by the depth of the questions that come from BARDA.
Thank
I
you,
think
Brian.
there's
This
a
is
little bit of
really
an art like FDA in terms of asking questions at the end to try and gauge what their level of enthusiasm is, as well
sure.
as better understand if they would like to have a follow-up call as well. Because BARDA does have to be a little bit cautious about what they say in these meetings in terms of forward-looking statements. It can be
Okay.
helpful to have somebody who has a little bit of background in government in general to help you try and read the tea leaves about what it is they're trying to convey to you.
Sounds good. One last question related
Of
to
course.
this. How deeper you can be, how regarding the scientific aspect of your proposal? Like, do you want to focus on a strategy or do you want to focus on the science?
Oh, in terms of it's a little bit of A and a little bit of B. I usually
Okay.
start off saying, describe the underlying science for your technology. Let's say it's a
Mhm.
therapeutic, right? What
Yeah.
is the mechanism of action that makes it unique, right?
Okay.
And then the real exciting data are going to be things like proof of concept efficacy data, ideally
Okay.
in an animal model that reflects how the product would be used in a public health emergency. For
Sounds good.
example, um, if you were to receive an antibiotic, X number of days after being exposed to the biological agent, does your animal model reflect that timeline as well?
Okay.
From there, you want to pitch what your development program looks like, which is to say,
Sounds
the next steps would be to carry it through phase two. We think the study would roughly look like this. It would roughly cost this much. That
Okay.
essentially becomes the plan moving forward that you'd want to put in front of BARDA for feedback to them so they can say, does the FDA agree with this? I have concerns about the design of your phase two program. We can discuss that a little bit later on, things of that nature.
Sounds good. Thank you so much, Brian. This is helpful.
Yeah, of course, of course. Okay. Any other questions before I move on to the general thinking of how academics can work with BARDA? If there are none, just wanted to raise a couple of things. There is a little bit of caution within BARDA about partnering directly with academic institutions for product development. And part of that is they have found historically that academics have a little bit of a different mindset than, say, pharmaceutical companies when it comes to product development. So that's not to say academic institutions can't work on product development spaces, but you need to start thinking a little bit more like a drug company, right? A lot of it has to be that real world utility within the context of a public health emergency. For example, you'll often see proof of concept efficacy data where you give the therapeutic minutes after they're exposed to the threat agent. That doesn't track to how the product would actually be used in a, bioterrorism attack. So you have to think about doing proof of concept in a way that shows your drug would work in the envisioned response, what they call concept of operations. I also referenced before the importance for finding commercial potential if possible for your product type. Not everything can go in the stockpile. The government doesn't have enough money to put everything in the stockpile. So if your product has a commercial application, they would like to hear about that commercial development pathway as well, because that is essential to your product being around in the future if a public health emergency happens, because it has been taken up into hospitals for more routine care. Again, key drivers of interest for having a mature development program is that proof of concept data. Also, understanding what a regulatory strategy looks like towards FDA approval, ideally with FDA feedback from something like a pre-IND meeting or a Type C meeting or even a Q meeting for a device. At least a sketch of a clinical development program, or if you're going through what's called the animal efficacy rule, where you have to demonstrate efficacy in an animal model, understanding what that looks like. Understanding how you'll need to scale up your manufacturing to be able to produce things like clinical trial material and eventually do your registration batches for something like FDA approval. And of course, the quality systems. A lot of these studies are going to have to be run either GLP studies or GLP-like. Your manufacturing, of course, is also going to have to be GMP. That's good laboratory practices and current good manufacturing practices, if you're not familiar with them. Another component of this, of course, is contract management, which is a fairly substantial burden. I often joke with non-dilutive funding, they don't ask for an ownership stake of your company, but they do ask for a seat at the table. So they'll give themselves the right to do things like review your protocol and approve it before you can proceed for any non-clinical animal study or any clinical study. And because of that, you have to be really good about tracking all of the deliverables that BARDA wants you to track and running your biweekly meetings with them. And that takes a little bit of getting used to as well. Often the first 6 months are what we call learning how to BARDA. There's an old joke that getting a grant is like getting money from mom, and getting a contract is like getting money from dad, where it comes with a lot more strings attached. Dad wants to know a lot more about what you specifically are going to do with the money and to see receipts after you've spent it. Here are just a couple of real fast partnership models that academic companies can, rather, academic institutions can think about. This isn't to discourage you from trying to be the prime awardee of a research and development program, but there are just other ways you can do that as well. Part of it is just to use your IP to launch a startup company to become the kind of company that BARDA wants to work with. Part of it can be licensing your IP to an existing company that believes your technology has a lot of promise and wants to carry that program forward on your behalf, so to speak, with BARDA funding. You can do a collaborative development with an existing company and their IP if you're willing to do a lot of the early proof of concept studies in the national health security context. There are also some academic institutions that have specialized capabilities where you see them as perennial subcontracts. They make a lot of money off of BARDA in that respect, so to speak. Or you can also lead unique collaborative initiatives, such as those academic institutions that are leading things like CARB-X, which is Boston University. And because BARDA also retains relationships with service providers, for example, contract research organizations that can run animal studies on behalf of companies or BARDA, if you have unique core service provider capabilities, you can also apply for those opportunities to be a core service provider as well. I know a lot of academic institutes like to be in the non-clinical studies network if they have unique non-clinical studies capabilities. And just real quickly, I'll show you a couple of examples from the past. Perhaps one of the examples of a best case scenario is a company called Stratigraph, which was spun out by a professor at the University of Wisconsin at Madison, who noticed she had discovered a really unique uh, cell line for skin cells and was able to do a lot of early development funding, I think with funding from NIH and the Department of War. Eventually, that company Stratigraph got a research and development contract from BARDA, and eventually a Project Biotech, or rather, Project BioShield award that led to their product being put into the Strategic National Stockpile, where it is an essential medical countermeasure for national security. So, enormous success for this, what started as a research project at the University of Wisconsin. Here's an example of a licensed technology at Rockefeller University. Vincent Fischetti has done a lot of research in phage endolysins, basically enzymes that can break down cell walls of certain bacteria. This ended up being one of their technologies was licensed by a company called Conafay, which received BARDA funding eventually to conduct a phase 3 clinical trial to evaluate safety and efficacy. Here's an example where University of Colorado was able to take a drug from Genentech, do a couple of animal model studies with it, and then able to demonstrate with initial funding from actually NIH's Counteract program that the drug has potential to be used for sulfur mustard exposure. And as a result, then partnering with Genentech, they were able to get a research and development contract to pursue the development of this product further. Another example of a university that is often a frequent subcontractor, the University of Florida has the Institute for Therapeutic Innovation, which can do a lot of the pharmacodynamic pharmacokinetic preliminary studies for a lot of companies that want to work in the antibacterial space. So when I was in the antibacterials program at BARDA, I often saw them listed as a proposed subcontractor on many of their contracts. Another way in which companies can indirectly work with BARDA. And then this is just an example of every now and then there is a unique opportunity for a university to serve a key role in a BARDA initiative. here was Boston University, interestingly, their law school, which applied to become the performer for the CARB-X Biopharmaceutical Accelerator Program. This is a program that continues to this day to be receiving funding on the order of hundreds of millions of dollars to support early stage development of antibiotics. And then just lastly, as an example, I referenced that you can also be a member of BARDA's core services where you can provide things like non-clinical studies for companies. University of Maryland School of Medicine has a very good radiation oncology program, which they then turn into a translational science program where they can run studies for companies where they want to understand if a therapeutic or prophylactic has potential for combating radiation exposure or other radiological nuclear threat contexts. So again, just a couple of examples of how academic institutes have previously worked with BARDA that may serve as a bit of a roadmap for some of your capabilities as well. I know I covered a lot of ground there and not too much time left for additional questions, but happy to stick around a bit to answer any additional questions. Or if you'd like to chat with me individually, feel free to reach out through the rest of our Conafay engagement. I'm happy to join calls as well. Thank you for the opportunity to speak here. I really appreciate that.
Thank you, Brian. We have like 2, maybe 3 minutes for questions if anyone has a burning question they would like to ask Brian. I might come back and I would like to learn more about examples of opportunities to be a core service provider. I know we have a lot of very
Yeah.
unique facilities, and
Mhm.
even in the space of animal models, and more recently in this space of NAMs, like the novel approach methodology. So that's a topic where I think I personally would be very interested, and I know there's other people. So could you just elaborate a little bit about how do we insert ourselves into that role? Um,
Yeah, sure. Absolutely. I think one of the things we could do is organize a Tech Watch meeting where you could give a presentation around what those capabilities would look like. That's to say, we have the ability to run non-human primate studies that could be useful for these kinds of biodefense efficacy studies. If you have something like a BL-cell 3 lab, that's something they would want to hear more about. And then from there, we could try and have a discussion with BARDA's non-clinical studies division to see if there are animal models that you could establish that BARDA would want in its non-clinical studies network. From there, there's a little bit of surveillance about the next time there would be a recompetition for members of that non-clinical studies network, in which case we would try and help you prepare for that so that when that funding opportunity is posted by BARDA on sam.gov, you guys are well positioned to apply for it, as well as BARDA is anticipating your proposal and would want to make an award to it by virtue of your having a standing relationship, by virtue of their already being aware of the capabilities that they're very interested in. So I'd probably spend a little bit of time talking to you about what your capabilities are, seeing where
mhm.
there's overlap with BARDA's priorities, and then taking it from there. Okay. Any other questions?
I think
Brian,
people are
I
ready
have,
for. Oh, go ahead.
oh, sorry. If you have a 1 minute, just a quick one. If we do not have a
Yeah, go ahead.
proof of concept studies for the early development, would we still engage the tech watch, or should we wait to gather the proof of concept data?
Sure. You can go either way. They say TechWatch is not necessarily only for companies that are ready to apply right away. If you believe you have an early stage technology that you'd really like to get on the radar and get a little bit of feedback from the BARDA team about where you should go next, you can apply for a TechWatch. Oftentimes, it's a good idea if you need help networking into different funding agencies that can support that preclinical development. Keep in mind,
Okay,
places like the Defense Threat Reduction Agency, DTRA, will show up at these meetings. The NIH will show up at these meetings. They can often say, hey, I'd love to have a discussion with you based on your technology. Maybe I can support some of those proof of concept studies. Or
thank
if you're just missing one animal model study, sorry if I'm talking too long,
you.
they can often run those studies through the aforementioned non-clinical studies network. Say, hey, UC
Okay,
Davis has this great NHP model for evaluating against this bio threat. Maybe I can run it through the non-clinical studies network to get that data as well.
sounds good. Thank you, Brian. That's helpful again.
Of course.
I think we need you to come to campus, Brian, and maybe spend like a whole day with them.
Or have more
Of
sessions
course.
like this.
Heaven
Yes,
forbid I
maybe
have to
like have
spend more time in
another
California.
session. So it's 12:02, and I know it's afternoon for Brian and this lunch break for some of us. If you are interested in following up with Brian or with any of our colleagues at the Conafay team, I posted the email address in the chat is conafay@ucdavis.edu, and then I'll help you triage your question, and I'll work with Eric and Brian to figure out when we might be able to set up a meeting. I have a recording of the session that I will share with everyone, and then maybe Brian can share his slides with me also for our participants. And with that,
Yeah,
have
happy
a
to do
great
that.
long weekend. It's a holiday tomorrow at UC Davis. I hope you're going to be taking some time off and enjoying the cooler temperatures this weekend. Please feel free to reach out if I can help you with anything. Have a great break. Thank you, Brian.
No problem. Thanks, everyone.